afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of YouTube. I'm Chucky 2009, and tonight we're going to be talking about welding shop safety. Now, when I got into welding a few years back, for the most part, I had to learn everything the hard way. I bought a bunch of gear that didn't really work out so well. I burned myself a whole bunch of times. I got some metal stuck in my eye. It just, in general, kind of sucked, and I wish that I could have seen a video where someone was like, alright, I got a general feel for what's going on. If you're doing this, you want to keep this in mind, probably wear one of these. And long story short, here we are a few years later, and I really want to put that video together for you guys. I'm sure I'm going to miss a few tips here and there. That doesn't mean that they're not important. And as always, do everything at your own risk. Now in this video, I've decided that I'm going to put this together into chapters, which you should see over here. And we're going to be talking about some general shop safety stuff, and then we're going to be talking about safety practices that are specific to, say, MIG welding or TIG welding. Now the main thing that I'd like for y'all to keep in mind tonight is that, you know, safety isn't a specific practice or a specific way of doing things or a specific item you can buy that'll protect you from anything. Really, when you think about it, it's nothing more than mentality, and of course some gear that goes along with that. But what I like to tell myself, and what I like to keep in mind anytime I'm in a shop type environment, is I just tell myself everything is heavier than it looks. Everything is sharper than it looks. Every piece of metal you see is hot unless you have some reason to believe that it isn't and you can touch it. And most importantly, everything in here under the right circumstances can kill you. So I want to start this video off slow with just a couple less notable things that some people like to skip over. But first and foremost, we're going to be talking about how to inspect a set of welding leads. If you find some used, if you buy a used machine, or you know, if you've been using yours for a while, this might be good. Essentially what I'm doing is I'm just taking the lead here and I'm bending it over itself, and I'm looking through for cracks, and as you can see, I can't see any copper showing through. I can't see any cracks. So this is going to be good. If you do see some sort of cracking going on, then obviously your insulation's been compromised and it's probably not the safest lead to use anymore. So the next thing I want to show you guys is how to leak test something. Now, all you're going to need for this is, under ideal circumstances, a spray bottle filled with water and a little bit of dish soap. You know, you just mix it all together and shake it up really well. However, if you're out in the field and you don't have access to such things, you can usually get away with just taking a water bottle, like one of those single-use disposable water bottles, adding a little bit of hand soap to it and using that. However, I got the spray bottle, and essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take our suspect joint that's going to happen to be between the flow meter and the gas hose on the MIG welder here, and we're just going to take our mixture and we're going to spray it on this joint and see what happens. Now, if we're leaking gas, you'll see it bubbling up all over the place. It'll be really obvious what's going on. It's one of those deals where you'll probably know it when you see it. And then we're going to tighten this down a little bit here, and then once we get through with that, we're just going to go ahead and spray some more water on it and see if we still have this bubbling effect. If the bubbles are gone and the water just kind of trickles down and just does normal waterish things, then we're probably not leaking any gas. Yeah, I'd say that looks pretty good to me, YouTube. Alright, let's move on. So the next thing I want to talk about is compressed gas safety. Now, first and foremost, if you're going to be operating a cutting torch or doing some oxyacetylene welding, I highly recommend watching a video specifically dedicated for that. I'm not going to try and mix that into this video because it's going to make it even longer than it will undoubtedly turn out to be, and like I said, I already made a video about that. So if that is something you're interested in, I'll be sure to put a link in the description below. But what we're going to talk about now is two things. First and foremost, you know, your flammable gas is the one that everyone thinks is being dangerous, but a lot of people don't realize that other gases, like, you know, argon, for instance, which is completely inert and basically harmless to an extent, can also not be so harmless under the right circumstances. And what I mean by that is argon displaces air, of course. It displaces pretty much anything. And so if you're welding in like a pit or an enclosed location with very poor ventilation, there's a chance that the shielding gas that you're releasing from the cylinder could displace the air around you to the point where you can't breathe. Now, cases of this actually happening are very rare, and they're very far and few and far in between. I think that's how the saying goes. But regardless, it is something that you should keep in mind. When I was in school, they actually taught us if you're ever welding inside like a large enclosed cylinder or something, have someone keep an eye on you and check on you, or even go as far as, you know, tying a rope around yourself so they can pull you out if need be. So, you know, like I said, unless you're in a pit or there's just horrible ventilation, this probably won't be an issue for you. However, it's still something to keep in mind. What might be an issue, however, what's much more likely for someone to have an issue with in their garage or a similar setting is with a cylinder not being properly secured upright. Now I keep this one strapped to one of the beams in the shop and it's obviously not going anywhere, but it's really important to use chains, or I actually prefer straps like this one, to secure a cylinder upright. And the reason for that is there's a little valve on top of the cylinder, of course, and what's behind that valve is when it's full, around 2,000 psi give or take, just depending on the cylinder and what's in it. And you know, if anything happens to that, let's say the cylinder falls over and that thing gets sheared off, the cylinder is going to be gone like a rocket. You can watch videos online about this, I'm sure, if you can track them down. These things take off. I mean, that's a lot of pressure, and you know, the cylinder gets moved and it'll fly through buildings. It'll, needless to say, injure or seriously injure or kill someone. And so for that reason, it's really important to keep these cylinders chained in the upright position, or strapped if you prefer. Now the next thing I want to talk about kind of goes back to what I said earlier, which is pretty much anything under the right circumstances can kill you. Now think about some brake cleaner or some carburetor cleaner or something. Think about a piece of material you're going to weld that's really greasy and really oily. And I'm actually going to read you guys a story here posted on weldingweb.com by someone that goes by European Welding Specialist in Stuttgart, Germany. I probably pronounced that wrong. If so, I apologize. But basically what he says is, what happened was a friend of mine was doing some aluminum welding, was oil on the stuff. He used brake cleaner to clean it, and just before welding sprayed on a little more, waited a bit, welded about 4 inches, and fell over. His wife called me after the ambulance was there. I figured he just got shocked. Hospital called and said he had a name I can't pronounce. I get the impression that this individual's first language isn't English, but yeah, it just says a name I can't pronounce, poisoning. Anyway, it comes from when you mix a heated chemical that's in the brake cleaner with argon. The chemicals in brake cleaner turn to gas and mix with the argon. It is deadly, and my friend died today from it. And it's a really serious issue, and it's something that, believe it or not, a lot of people aren't familiar with. Anytime that I meet a newer welder, this is something that I tell them about, you know, if we get to talking about safety stuff somehow. But essentially, you know, it's chlorinated hydrocarbons, I believe is what it's called. And when you spray that on something and then you heat it, some people say that the argon makes it worse. Other people say the argon doesn't make a difference. Anyway, when it gets heated up, it produces what's referred to as phosgene gas. And phosgene gas can kill you, basically. It can kill you very, very easily. Believe it or not, it used to be used as a chemical weapon back in World War I, because it's a choking agent. You know, it chemically chokes you to the point where you can't breathe, and then there's not really too many dots left to connect. But there's information all over the internet about this. There's all sorts of stories on forums from this. There's people that say, you know, I just went out to weld this small project and I almost died today. And I'll put some information about this in the description of this video. I think it's something everyone needs to know about, and as mentioned, a lot of people don't. The other thing is, you know, you may be wondering, all right, well, obviously I don't want to use that stuff. What should I use? My recommendation is acetone. You know, chemically speaking, it's pretty inert. It's a very industry standard solvent. It's really cheap. I buy it by the gallon jug here. And these gallon jugs, I don't buy them very often because they last me so friggin' long. I want to say they're like somewhere between $20 and $30 a gallon. It's not very expensive stuff. In fact, if anything, it's probably even cheaper than buying a handful of cans of brake cleaner. And it doesn't leave behind any residue. It evaporates freakishly quickly. Chemically speaking, it's pretty inert, although I do recommend using the neoprene gloves, the rubber gloves, or something along those lines to keep it off your fingers. But that gets my recommendation. Now the next thing I want to talk about is what happens if you're just minding your own business, you know, just cutting some stuff up, or you're welding some stuff, and one thing leads to another, and you end up somehow setting yourself on fire. Well, if you're wearing man-made cloth like polyester or any of that smooth, shiny crap stuff, well, what's going to happen is, A, that's going to be much, much easier to light than, say, cotton, and B, not only is it going to burn, it's going to melt like to your skin and fuse itself to your skin, and the aftermath of that is a little mortifying. There's, you know, images of that, which I'm sure a person could find if they so chose. And the other thing is, you know, if that happens to you, a lot of people that go through this have had to get like skin grafts, not to mention going through, you know, excruciating operations to have that material separated from their skin, because, you know, once it's on there, it doesn't really want to come off. The alternative to that is to wear something that's entirely cotton. Like you usually see me in these videos, of course, just welding away in a good old pair of usually Wrangler blue jeans, which serve me really well. Maybe a t-shirt, something along those lines, you know, underneath the welding jacket, of course. And the reason for that is cotton, A, is much harder to get it to light, and B, more importantly, it actually just burns. You know, if you're wearing a pair of jeans and your jeans catch on fire, you know, you just pat it out, maybe you get a little burn, you know, probably not going to be the end of the world, compared to, of course, having the material physically fuse itself to your skin. And it's not like quality garments for welding are that difficult to find. Our good friends at VSX and Black Stallion, which have of course provided the gear we're going to be using and looking at in this video, make a wide variety of flame resistant cotton gear. So not only do you have the cotton, you also have the flame resistant material. They make this nice blue welding jacket. These things are awesome. They make jeans which look nice. I can't say I've tried them out yet. I'm looking forward to that. They even make some really nice flame resistant cotton t-shirts, which honestly I think are nicer than a lot of the clothes in my closet. But either way, you know, cotton is, I definitely wear something that's all cotton, and flame resistant cotton gets you huge bonus points. They make a lot of gear. I'll put some links in the description to that as well. But long story short, just don't wear anything that's man-made that's going to fuse to your skin as opposed to something that, well, it's just going to burn. Something else you'll want to keep in mind is when you go to open a compressed gas cylinder like this, you're going to want to turn that knob very slowly until the high pressure side of the regulator, in our case a flow meter of course, is the same pressure as what's on the inside of the cylinder. And you'll know that when you see it, because simply put, you know, that needle is going to stop rising, and that's when you know things have equalized. Now let's see that again. As you can see, I'm just opening this slowly until that needle stops, and I open it really quick. And the reason for this is because, as mentioned before, there's a lot of pressure on the inside of that cylinder, and if you just, you know, give that thing a really firm yank and send it flying open, then what you're doing is all that pressure is going to hit the inside of your flow meter, you know, like a freight train, and it's going to greatly accelerate wear on your flow meter or your regulator, or if your flow meter or regulator is already worn, it can cause it to literally explode. Also, for that reason, in case that happens, which, you know, isn't likely, that happens very rarely, but again, you want to take the applicable precautions. You never want to stand directly in front of the regulator. Like when you stare at a regulator, like we're seeing here, and you can see the face, you don't want to be standing where the camera is. You want to take a step or step or two to the right. So that way, if something does go kerblowy, then the pieces should, for the most part, fly past you. But again, you're probably not going to have any issues with that. Now, what is very likely is that you'll, at some point, take on some kind of welding endeavors wearing gardening gloves or stereotypical mechanics gloves like this gray glove we got over here, and learn, just like I did, unfortunately speaking experience here, that anything except for a leather backing probably isn't going to do anything to stop sparks and stuff from going through. I used to weld in garden gloves, and stuff would go through the back and burn up the back of my hands. That always really hurt. So long story short, just don't. Now, if you want to wear something other than traditional welding gloves, there are definitely options out there. This is what I consider to be a very nice top-of-the-line welding helmet. Something like this will run $300 to $400 if you go out and buy one brand new. And I realize that a lot of people, especially those just getting into welding now, just plain and simple don't have that kind of money to spend on a helmet like this. And I understand that, you know, I've been there myself. When I first got going, my first welder barely cost $400. And in fact, it was a $75 Craigslist special. I know that's how a lot of people get started. And you may be wondering, you know, what you should do in that situation, because you obviously don't want to take chances with your eyes, but again, this might very well be out of your price range if you're just getting started. And in my opinion, you'd be better served by a good quality fixed shade, aka not auto darkening helmet, than a cheap auto darkening helmet. The cheap auto darks always bothered my eyes. I've used, I don't know, probably 20-30 different low cost auto darkening helmets, and some are better than others and some are fairly nice. But generally speaking, the headgear isn't nearly as good. It's not going to hold up nearly as well or be nearly as comfortable. The image isn't going to be very clear. Comparatively speaking, it's going to be a lot more difficult to see out of. And worst of all, in my case, they used to just straight up hurt my eyes. There's not really anything else to say about it, but a good quality fixed shade helmet. Jackson makes an awesome one that's like 40 bucks or something, brand new. That's something that's going to hold up really well. It should serve you for years and years as a backup hood, or if you're going to be working at a sketchy job site, you don't want to take a nice helmet with you. You take that, and if it gets jacked, well, new one's 40 bucks. So there's that to keep in mind. And one of the other questions that people very commonly ask me is, how do I know if I'm welding with the proper shade? Well, what I like to tell people is, if you're looking at your weld puddle where you're just welding along and you can see everything great, you see the puddle, you see the arc, you see the piece of material around it, you see your car out in the parking lot, alright, that might be stretching it a little bit, but you can see everything just fine, and the problem is that your eyes are starting to hurt, It's starting to feel like you've been staring at a computer screen all day, or watching TV for a week straight, or something along those lines. Well, in that case, you're probably running too light of a shade, and you'll want to switch out your lens for another lens, unless you're using an auto dark, in which case you want to turn it up a notch or something. And whereas the other extreme is if you just see a little bit of light coming through and you can't really make anything out, you're really having to focus and strain your eyes to see that. Now, that's probably the opposite. You're welding with too high of a shade, and you should come down a shade or two. And just repeat until you get, about to where you want to be. And the thing that a lot of people don't realize is that, I think that welding with too high of a shade is going to be really hard on your eyes as well, because although you're not being blinded by a lot of light that's coming through, you're having to strain and look, and that's also going to make your eyes feel fatigued pretty soon. So, yeah, in that case, just go down. In the other case, just go up a shade and just mess around with it until you get a good setting. Now, if you don't know where to start, I'd recommend a shade 10 for most things, unless you have light blue eyes or something similar and you're like me and they're sensitive, and in which case you might want to start off with like a shade 11. Now, while we're on the subject of stuff that you might want to consider buying that you may or may not have previously considered when you first got into welding, let's talk about respirators like this. Now, there's a lot of times when you'll be welding or doing some metalworking or whatever, and you don't want to breathe in everything that's going in the air. For instance, maybe you're plasma cutting, plasma dust is really fine, and it's easy to breathe in. Maybe you're grinding, you're shooting very fine bits of metal through the air, and there's fiberglass and stuff coming out of your disc, or maybe you can't get something clean, or you can't get the back of it clean or something. It's covered in like 6 coats of paint and like a bunch of grease and oil and stuff. It's going to be smoking out of your shop. Well, what do you do then? What I recommend is, aside from like some large fans that are working outside or something to do with your ventilation, picking up a nice 3M respirator like this. Now, this is what I understand to be a specially designed welding respirator, and these things are cheap. I mean, under 40 bucks, if I remember correctly what I paid for this. The cool thing is, it fits underneath your welding helmet, and it's so light, and you almost forget it's there. I'm not going to say you do forget it's there, but it's pretty close, and these things work phenomenally well. I've been welding on painted stuff. No, it wasn't painted, it was greasy. I know what I was doing. I was taking an old air compressor tank, turning it into a barbecue, for instance, and there's like 40 years worth of compressor oil inside this thing. It was freaking disgusting when I started. And I'm just welding away, and I could see the smoke just flowing up underneath my helmet, and it was just everywhere. And to be honest, guys, I could not even smell it. That is how well these respirators work. Occasionally you have to switch out those little pink filter things, but for the most part, I think it's a solid investment. And so I highly recommend picking up one of these little filters. One of these respirators, if there's any way that you can. Now, as you all already probably know, and anybody who's ever been through a high school shop class can tell you, there's few things out there more important than a good quality pair of safety glasses, and even more important than that is wearing them properly anytime you're in or around the welding shop. Now, at first I thought that they were a major inconvenience too, and I don't really like them either, but then I got used to them, and then I forgot I was wearing them. And then shortly thereafter, I would start to feel kind of naked when I wasn't wearing safety glasses. And I know that may make me sound lame, but I don't really care, because I've never had arc eye, and I've had a multitude of stuff hit me in the safety glasses. For instance, probably just a week or two ago now, I was just welding away, and I stopped to chip some slag. Big old chunk, this was hot stuff too. I stopped welding like maybe 10 seconds beforehand, just however long it takes to flip up the helmet, grab the slag, chip and hammer. Big old chunk of slag comes flying up, nails me in the safety glasses, and you know what happened? Absolutely nothing. It just bounced off. I was like, oh, that was kind of crazy. And then I just kept on chipping slag and went back to welding, and life continued as normal. And the reason I tell you guys this story is because, you know, that was really flying. It was obviously really hot, and if I hadn't have been wearing safety glasses at the time, there probably would have been some really serious damage to my eye. And that's just one story. I saw this picture on Facebook of someone that had a metal shard actually poking through the lens. And, you know, crazy stuff happens, and a good pair of safety glasses will not only protect you from things flying through the air, like the aforementioned, but also will work to protect you against getting flashed. And that's the other thing I want to talk about. Even clear lenses like this can work to your benefit for such things, because when you look at someone welding, you're really seeing two things. You're seeing a large quantity of relatively harmless light. It's only harmful because there's so much of it, and there's invisible light, there's the UV light, and that's the stuff that, you know, the way I understand it, I'm not an eye doctor or an expert or anything, but that's what will give you arc eye. That's what can really hurt you. And a good pair of safety glasses will filter out the harmful light, so all you're seeing is the sheer quantity of relatively, comparatively of course, harmless light. And I've flashed myself a number of times, but never gotten actual arc eye from it. And I contribute that to a good pair of safety glasses. And the other thing, safety glasses related, that I want to talk about briefly are these dark glasses here. Now, I actually use these as sunglasses in my truck. I like them so much. But the thing is, where I'm going with this, if you're working around someone in the same shop or in the same, you know, just general close proximity as someone else that's also welding, if you wear the darker glasses and you look at them welding, you just glance at them or something, it's really going to be easier on your eyes at the end of the day if you're wearing the darker glasses than the clear ones in that particular circumstance. Alright, so now that we've discussed some general shop safety type information, I figure we should move on to talking about individual welding processes, and the first thing that I want to talk about is going to be MIG welding. Why? Because it's a great process for someone that wants to get into welding. It's very easy to learn, comparatively speaking. There's a lot you can do with it, and, you know, like anything else, it's got its place, and I find it to be very versatile, in my opinion. Now, I've found that MIG welding, comparatively speaking, puts out a minimal amount of smoke, which is good, but it does produce a surprisingly large amount of spatter compared to some other things. And that's going to be the main issue that we're going to be focused on, you know, when we talk about MIG welding safety. Now, something you'll want to keep in mind is if you're welding on something that's just sitting on your welding bench and, you know, you're welding it in the flat or horizontal position, that shouldn't cause you too many issues. However, if you're MIG welding vertically or overhead, all that spatter has to go somewhere, and gravity is just going to pull it back down, and that's all going to be coming right back at you. And so for that reason, I recommend, you know, catering the level of protection you're wearing gear-wise to what you happen to be doing. For instance, if you're going to be working out of position, I recommend wearing, you know, something heavier duty, like this nice set of welding leathers, for instance, just because this is going to have a higher level of protection than a standard cotton welding jacket, which alternatively would probably be fine for welding something in the flat position. Now, much like with anything else, you're going to want to match the type of gloves you're wearing to the type of welding and the type of work that you're doing. Here I've got three very common types of welding gloves. On the left, we've got our TIG welding gloves. These are going to be thinner. They're going to not offer quite as much protection against sparks and spatter and things that aren't really associated with TIG welding, of course. Then on the right, on the other hand of the spectrum, we've got our really heavy-duty stick welding gloves. These are going to offer protection against the aforementioned, but they're not, you know, you're not going to have nearly as much dexterity with those as you would with the TIG welding gloves. And the MIG welding gloves we're going to be looking at kind of fall in the middle of the spectrum. They're deerskin gloves. They've got a really nice 4.5-inch cuff on them, so that way you don't have to worry about, you know, sparks and spatter and stuff rolling down the glove into your hand as much. They're stitched with flame-resistant Kevlar, and they're lined. You know, they're really comfortable, and you can still feel what you're doing, and they're something that I recommend for pretty much any MIG welding that you might find yourself doing. Now let's talk about TIG welding. Now, one of the biggest risks, I guess you could say, with TIG welding is what's commonly referred to as high frequency, and this is relatively harmless, but it'll still give you a pretty good jolt, and it's notoriously hard on electronics and other such things. Essentially what this high frequency is what's used to initiate the arc between, you know, the tip of your electrode and the piece of material that you're welding on without actually touching the tip of the electrode to the material. You know, you got your high frequency that sort of bridges the gap like that, and then a real arc would take over. And of course, if you're welding on aluminum, a lot of the time you'll end up using continuous high frequency. So you won't just be running this to start the arc, but it'll be going throughout the entirety of the welding processes and in a lot of circumstances. And the risk with this is, as mentioned, it'll really give you a good jolt if you happen to be TIG welding in a t-shirt and you're leaning on your table or your workpiece or whatever, or alternatively if you're wearing a long sleeve t-shirt or maybe even a welding jacket and it's wet for some reason. Maybe you're working in a wet environment, maybe you're sweating through it, and either way, your skin ends up in contact with something that's grounded when that's going on, and you end up zapping yourself that way. It gives you a good little jolt. I don't know if anyone's ever really been injured by it, but it's definitely something to be aware of. The other thing is, you know, a lot of people like to sort of put aside the risks of TIG welding because they see people on TV welding in like t-shirts and such things, and my opinion on that is, A, it's never really a good idea for obvious reasons, but welding without proper safety gear is especially not a good idea when you're TIG welding, because when you look at someone stick welding, you're not really just seeing the arc. You're seeing the arc, and there's droplets of material flying across the arc, so it's not just pure energy, and then there's all the smoke and everything that's going on around it, and all of that stuff kind of works to filter the arc. But when you're TIG welding, you don't have any of that stuff. There's no material flying across the arc, and there's minimal, if any, smoke going on, and so what you're seeing is pretty much just pure light, and if you're just wearing a t-shirt or something, you're going to get burned like no other, because there's, you know, more so than you normally would, there's nothing to slow down the intensity of that arc. Now, TIG welding safety gear is especially minimal because TIG just isn't a process that, as I'm sure you know, produces sparks and spatter and anything along those lines, so that way, you know, you don't have to wear like a big heavy set of welding leathers or anything along those lines. What I recommend is something like this nice flame-resistant cotton welding jacket. It's flame-resistant, of course. That's an added bonus. It's specially designed for welding. There's like a soapstone pocket and some pockets on the inside. If you don't have anything like this, you can do what I used to do, which is just wear like an old denim shirt or a canvas shirt or something along those lines. Pretty much anything that's just going to protect your skin from the light and the intensity of that welding arc. And TIG gloves are something else that you'll want to consider because, as I'm sure you know, you're going to want a lot of added dexterity when you're TIG welding. It's a very fine process that requires fine motor skills. Now let's take a moment to discuss my personal favorite welding process, the shielded metal arc, or as a lot of people just refer to it, stick welding process. Now I've decided to roll in information from flux core welding into this part of the video because flux core, as I'm sure you know, is basically just stick welding from a spool. There's a lot of similarities between the two processes, and I feel like a lot of the safety information we're about to discuss is going to carry directly over to that as well. Now, some of the main safety concerns when you're stick welding just come from the extreme amount of smoke and the extreme amount of spatter that's produced. You know, stick is, and flux core too for that matter, are probably two of the smokiest welding processes out there. So of course you're going to want to pay attention to make sure you have good ventilation. If you can't have good, you know, natural ventilation, then, you know, you're going to probably want to consider wearing a respirator or maybe setting up some fans if that's an option to you. I guess a fume extractor is probably the best way to go, but I realize that's not practical for a lot of people, especially those just starting out. But, you know, you got the smoke to keep in mind, of course. You've got the spatter as well. So you can see here, you know, the amount and the quantity of spatter which you should expect is just going to vary depending upon, you know, what it is that you're doing. Some electrodes like the 7018 here produce very, very minimal spatter. Others like 6010 and 6011, as you can see, produce, well, a lot of spatter. Now, just like when we talked about MIG welding, what I recommend for stick welding is that you cater the type and level of protection that you're wearing to whatever you happen to be doing at the time. For instance, you know, if you're going to be doing something that's much more heavy duty, that's going to produce a lot more heat through, a lot more sparks probably, you might want to consider a full leather welding jacket, such as this one here, which I'm actually trying out for the very first time in this video. This is the Duralight Premium Pigskin Welding Jacket, and the cool thing about this is it supposedly weighs half as much as a traditional cowhide welding jacket, but still has twice the durability. Now this, or traditional welding leather jacket, will protect you from just about anything that you'll ever do. However, you know, you might not need that. If you're just working away with something that's not going to produce a lot of spatter, like an 1/8 inch 7018 like 120 amps, you're just working away on your bench, then you can probably get away with wearing the same flame resistant cotton welding jacket that you've seen me wear, you know, all throughout this video and all throughout a number of other videos that I've made. And, you know, officially you're probably better off wearing the full set of welding leathers, but unofficially I've built so much stuff wearing these jackets and never been burned, and I know a lot of people do at the same time. Again, what I'd like you to take away from this is just keep in mind what you're doing and cater the level of protection jacket-wise to, you know, what you happen to be working on. Now let's talk about stick welding gloves. There's all different sorts and types of stick welding gloves out there on the market today, and they all have, you know, a number of similarities. For instance, they're going to be really heavy duty to protect you from the sparks and the spatter and the heat and everything that's associated with stick welding, and they're probably not going to offer you quite as much dexterity as a good pair of TIG gloves. And the reason why I really like these gloves is that, believe it or not, I've been wearing these things since I was back in high school. I've been through, I don't even know how many pairs, but they've always served me really, really well. They're just good, traditional, split cowhide leather stick welding gloves. They hold up well, they're very affordable, and you can find these things anywhere. You know, you can find them all over the internet, needless to say. I've been in the smallest little, you know, local welding supply stores that nobody's ever seen or heard of, and they've got a whole selection of 320s in all different shapes and sizes. They really are favored among welders, and they're remarkably comfortable for being a pair of stick welding gloves. You know, they've got what's referred to as cushion core technology, and they just, you know, they're stitched with flame-resistant Kevlar, and they just plain hold up really, really well. I've had excellent experiences with these gloves throughout the years, and it's just a good, solid pair of stick gloves. You know, they're easy to find, they're affordable to buy, and they protect you from all the associated hazards that go along with stick welding. Now I just want to briefly talk about plasma cutting safety. I don't think I've ever made a dedicated plasma cutting safety video like I have the torch safety video, which isn't why we're going to discuss torch cutting in this video. But essentially, with plasma cutting, you know, it's a relatively worry-free process. It's a process that I consider to be exceptionally safe and very practical and very versatile for a lot of applications. But, you know, that being said, there's still a few things to keep in mind. I know that a lot of people kind of underestimate the plasma cutting arc, not realizing that it's still an electric arc. It's a lot brighter than something that comes off of a cutting torch, and for that reason, I very, very highly recommend that you don't use a pair of Shade 5 lenses or similar if you're going to be looking at the arc. Now, if you're just drag cutting, so the arc is almost entirely in the plate, and, you know, you want to do that, I guess that's one thing, but in terms of actually, you know, holding the tip of the torch up above the plate itself, and you're kind of watching exactly where you're cutting, you know, you're going to be seeing that arc directly, and in those circumstances, I definitely recommend a traditional welding helmet, or, you know, you can do what I do, which is to just wear the full welding helmet with the shade turned all the way down, which on this helmet is like a shade 8 or a shade 9, and I can still see everything that goes on just fine with that. I can see a line if I'm trying to follow it. My eyes never feel sore from, you know, seeing too much light, whereas when I used to, you know, plasma cut with a pair of Shade 5 lenses, you know, the same things that I'd use if I was torch cutting, that I'd experience some pretty severe eye fatigue because it was just plain bright. You know, like I said, this is still an electric arc, and I strongly recommend that you treat it as such, even though a lot of people don't. And, you know, I'm not really here to protect people from themselves. I'm just trying to state some facts about this and some other things, and kind of let you come to your own conclusions. But I highly recommend treating this much like a welding arc and wearing a face shield if you're going to be looking at the arc itself. And, you know, the other things that go along with that are you don't want to expose skin to it. I know that I've plasma cut in the t-shirt plenty of times, probably more than I really should. Not particularly proud of that, but to be honest, I have. And, you know, I've been relatively okay with that. I've gotten a little burned sometimes here and there, but definitely treat it like it's a welding arc. And I very, very highly recommend wearing a respirator anytime you plasma cut, or I believe I'm plasma gouging here now. Maybe I'm cutting. I don't know. It's kind of hard to see. But the reason for that is plasma cutting dust is very, very fine, and it's got all the air pressure behind it that's coming out your plasma torch, and it's just going to be going all over the place and all over your shop. And that's the kind of thing that, you know, sometimes if I'm plasma cutting for a while and not wearing a respirator, which luckily I don't really do often, if at all anymore, you know, you still feel like a kind of like a cigarette filter at the end of the day, breathing all that stuff in. And on a final note, plasma cutting is loud. You know, the cutting itself isn't particularly loud, but you've got all that air screaming out the end of your plasma torch and going through the plate, and that in and of itself is kind of loud. And again, much like wearing a welding helmet, it's something that a lot of people don't do, but it's something that I very highly recommend doing, you know, to wear some earplugs like I'm wearing here, or something along those lines, just to protect yourself from that and play it safe. So now that we've covered the major welding processes, I just want to take a few moments here and talk about some more power tool, general shop type safety things. And the reason for that is, angle grinder safety. What we're going to be discussing now is, in my opinion, probably the single most overlooked tool safety-wise, just in my opinion from what I've seen. And angle grinders are probably something you're going to get really familiar with. I probably spend more time grinding material, to clean it, bevel it, prepare it, what have you, for welding than I actually spend welding. And I've been told by someone who, I don't want to go into too much detail, but I have every reason to believe he knows exactly what he's talking about, that 1 in 4 small power tools sold worldwide is an angle grinder. And I mean, they're everywhere. It's something you're going to get to know, so I figure we might as well take a few moments and talk about safety. Now, one thing here that I used to be really bad about is running these grinding wheels all the way down to pretty much nothing. And, rumor has it that that is not a particularly safe practice. There's a much higher chance that something like that can kind of explode and go everywhere. Something else that I want to talk about is cutting discs. These are very thin. They're, of course, used for just slicing through material, and they're particularly dangerous just because they're so thin. These are much more likely to, explode basically than a comparable abrasive, hard grinding wheel, mostly as stated because they're so thin and also because of what they're used for. A hard abrasive grinding wheel that you use to bevel something isn't going to be physically inside a piece of material, and if you're halfway through a cut and you've got, a good section of this angle grinder wheel inside of a piece of whatever you're cutting, and you twist the angle grinder to the side, or the piece of material moves or something, it can bind up and then explode, and there's fragments that go everywhere. This is why I highly recommend keeping the shield on your angle grinder, just for that reason. I know a lot of people like to take those off for various reasons. It's definitely not a practice that I recommend, but some people like to do that. I don't think it's a particularly good idea, and I can't say I've ever had a reason to, but again, that's just me. Now let's talk about angle grinder safety tools here. You got the return of the respirator, of course, and this is here simply because, those wheels, that abrasive material, there's a little bit of fiberglass that holds them together. That's not stuff you want to breathe in. This is, of course, going to produce a very fine steel dust if you're, just grinding on a piece of material. All that gets launched into the air and then, of course, sucked into your lungs, and wearing a good old 3M respirator can really protect you from that as well. Then you got safety glasses. That should go without saying. You don't want to get sparks and bits of material that happen to be going through the air into your eyes. We got hearing protection. That's another thing that is a little bit controversial. There's a number of people out there that don't particularly care to wear their, their hearing protection when they're angle grinding. People will tell you, oh, it's not that loud. Well, my take on that is it's definitely way above the safe decibel level for things that you can listen to without damaging your ears. And some folks are like, it doesn't bother me anymore. You just have to build up a tolerance to it. And no, what you're doing isn't building up a tolerance to the angle grinder. What you're doing is deafening yourself to the point where the angle grinder doesn't really bother you anymore. I mean, that's definitely not one and the same. And it's something that's overlooked. My advice for anyone that's trying to get into welding is don't try to be, Mr. Tough Guy and, I don't need this piece of safety gear, because, you do, or else you're not going to be able to hear things when you're older. Your body's going to suffer because of that mentality, and it's definitely not something that I recommend. Now, if you don't want to wear traditional hearing muffs, which is perfectly understandable, I know they're kind of clunky, they can get in the way, they interfere with wearing other things on your head, you can just wear a good pair of earplugs. And the next thing I want to talk about specifically is the face shield. And the one remotely semi-serious injury that I've had in my 5 years of welding, which I've been really lucky here, knock on wood, was when I was grinding on actually a manifold for an old tractor that I was working on. And I was just using an angle grinder. I was just wearing a pair of safety glasses. The safety glasses actually fit to my face pretty well. But regardless, a big old spark, I actually watched it fly up away from the angle grinder, and it went above my field of vision. Then I felt something go in my eye. And, well, you can probably tell where that's going. I ended up having to go to the hospital and have it drilled out the next day. My eye had an eye patch. I was on all sorts of painkiller drugs and drugs for my eye. I had stuff I had to put in it and stuff. It really wasn't fun at all. And so for that reason, now I officially recommend never angle grinding with less than 2 layers of protection. I really like the face shield because it's an added sense of security. It's not one that I ever really thought that I wanted, to be brutally honest, but it's here now, and I feel so much better when I'm running an angle grinder underneath a face shield. And, you know, everybody makes a decent quality face shield. This one happens to be a fiber metal. I gotta say, I'm pretty happy with it. I know Jackson Safety also makes them. I'm sure 3M does. I think even Hypertherm makes a face shield. They're out there. They're easy to find. And they're just, it's an added layer of protection, and it's one that now, having gotten to use it, is not one that I would ever want to be without, because I know I definitely don't want to go through that again, even though it wasn't the most serious injury in the world, and I certainly wouldn't wish it upon anyone else. Now, something else that you might want to consider if you're going to be doing any real quantity of, you know, grinding, which, let's face it, you probably will, might be getting a pair of gloves with vibration dampening technology. Now, there's really nothing to be afraid of when it comes to running an angle grinder, but it's definitely something that you want to, you know, pay attention to what you're doing and be careful about. And a few things to keep in mind are vibration is the enemy. Vibration is going to lead to, you know, discs exploding potentially. So if, you know, you're just grinding away and the grinder is really shaking, something's probably not right. There's a chance your wheel's not on there in a centered fashion. There's a chance something else is going on. It's really best to stop and check that out. And the other thing is, if you're going to be using a grinder, you should really just take a moment and inspect the surface of the disc that's on it. Now, this cutting wheel looks fine to me, and I say that because we're looking, there doesn't appear to be any chips or any cracks or anything. If there's either of those or any other defects, you know, just get rid of it. These things can do horrendous damage. There's a picture floating around the internet a while back of a guy with like a half moon shaped grinding wheel literally sticking out of his cheek, you know, just sticking out of his face. I guess it exploded somehow, and that's where it ended up. And there's people that are injured and killed with angle grinders just because they don't take them seriously. You know, it's a really serious tool, but with a few smaller things you can do just to pay attention and be careful about what you're doing there, it's a very safe tool, I have to say that. So yeah, just avoid vibration, make sure whatever you're doing is clamped down, because as mentioned, you know, if something comes loose and there's a cutting disc and it can shatter that disc and then pieces go flying everywhere. Vibration's the enemy, and check over your discs and your grinders before use, and I very strongly recommend leaving the guard on them as well. Alright, now I guess the last thing for us to talk about in this video is safety when you're using a handheld drill or a drill press like this Porter cable unit that I have behind me here. And a lot of the same fundamentals from general shop safety are going to carry over into this. For instance, you don't want to have loose clothing, you don't want to be wearing anything that can get caught in the drill. I know a lot of guys don't even like to wear gloves. A lot of other people tell you should wear gloves when you're running a drill. That's kind of a never-ending debate. I don't really want to get in the middle of that. But one thing that I will say is you definitely don't want to wear a ring on your finger, because you may or may not have heard of, you know, a person being degloved. And basically what that means is they were wearing probably a ring, and a piece of machinery either caught the glove that was on them and pulled it off, and that pulled the ring off, or somehow the ring got pulled off. And it basically, what it does is it just takes the skin off from the entire finger. And if you want to see some really horrific pictures, or if you don't know what I'm talking about, you can just Google degloving with the safe search off, and that should illustrate things pretty well. But before we get going with the drill press here, I just want to tell you a little bit of a horror story from my past. It's not that horrific. I guess all things considered, I've probably been pretty lucky. But several years ago, when I was pretty new to welding, I was drilling a hole with a pretty good sized drill bit and a steel block. I want to say it was like 2-inch flat stock, probably 1 inch thick, and it was short. It was only like 3-4 inches long. And partly because of that, partly because I didn't really know what I was doing, I didn't have it anchored down particularly well. And however I had it anchored down didn't work, and it came loose. And I just remember standing there with my hand on the handle for the drill press, watching this piece spinning around like that on the drill press table, and my eyes are just going like that. And you know, because obviously if that gets loose or the bit breaks, it's going to go flying, and it's got enough weight and it's going fast enough. It's going to hurt a lot. You're going to get some kind of horrendous bruise, possibly you know, broken bones, bad things along those lines, just depending on the piece and the drill. But I let up. In hindsight, probably wasn't the best thing I could have done, but I let up the pressure on the drill press, and this thing launched. It flew like a good 50-20 feet into a corner where I had a fluorescent light tube, like for these things in the shop here. Similar, actually probably identical to what's up here, and it just shattered this thing. I'm just sitting there over the drill press like, whoa, what just happened? And that was the day that I learned the importance of properly anchoring things down when you're drilling through them. Now, something else that you might want to consider is clamping things down to a drill press in a way that if they came loose, for whatever reason, they end up flying into the drill press itself rather than the person operating the drill press. For instance, I've got this piece of 2-inch square tube set up in my vise like I was about to drill a hole in it, and the way this is set up, you know, if it got loose, assuming we were drilling clockwise like we would be, this is just going to launch and it's going to hit that pole and it's going to transfer a lot of its energy into the pole, even if it doesn't completely stop it, even if it bounces off, whatever the case is, versus the alternative of this, which would be putting the majority of that square tube on the other side of the vise and having it come loose and swing towards where the camera is and where the operator would be standing at the time. And so, you know, this isn't really something you should count on by any stretch of the imagination, but as mentioned, whenever possible, I really like to set things up this way so that I, know if something happened, there's a good chance that the drill press would sort of protect me from my own lack of tying things down right or whatever happened to cause this. So that's just something else to keep in mind. And now on one final note, I just want to leave you guys with a few safety tips for when you're operating a handheld drill, drilling through some metal like what we're doing here. And first and foremost, always brace for a kickback. Expect that this drill is going to lock up, especially if you're running a larger diameter drill bit or a hole saw like what we're doing here. And what I mean by that is if one of the teeth on this hole saw grab a little bit of material and it stops turning, then that drill is of course going to want to keep turning and it's going to go flying into you. It could be a little bit hard to control. And what I recommend for avoiding that is to keep a really tight grip on the drill. Using a side grip like this one that I got here will really help you in this. And also use a slower, cutting speed versus, really just winding this thing out, plowing in, because if you're doing that and it locks up and kicks back, that's really going to hurt, but this would be fairly controllable. Also, if you're putting your weight into the drill like I'm doing here, which may or may not be the best thing for your bits, by the way, but it really speeds things up, then always be prepared for this to give way and for you to go flying forward, because I've actually seen people lose their balance doing this and they lean in too much, and it's a bad time. So you got that to keep in mind. And on a final note, I highly recommend, I highly recommend keeping your jaw closed no matter what you're doing when you're operating a handheld drill, because if there's a kickback or an impact or anything, then, that way you don't bite your tongue or slam your jaw into your upper teeth. It's a smaller thing, but it's just something that I like to keep in mind. So, I really hope that this video has served you well. It's been a blast to make. I really hope that you guys have enjoyed it. And as mentioned, it's not meant to encompass every safety tip ever devised for a welding or metalworking environment, but hopefully this will get you going in the right direction. And I'd just like to thank you for watching. Have fun and stay safe, everybody.